So if you start playing notes together, it doesn't really matter if you're playing chords or you're playing a melody or whatever. The human brain has this really weird tendency. Let's say I just play a couple chords, like C chord, here's an inverted F chord, a G chord, and back to C chord. Now the human brain will pick out one of those notes. In this case, it's going to pick out this C, and it's going to just sort of fall in love with it. It's going to think, oh man, I really like this C. When I hear this C, I feel relaxed and I feel comfortable. And it's going to start kind of filtering all the other notes around that C. If I hear a B natural, it sounds tense and it has this little bit of anxiety attached to it. Like it needs to resolve back into that C, and the C, feels really comfortable. And it's kind of weird, right? Because there's nothing about a B natural that sounds that way on its own. It's only because your brain is hearing it and comparing it to C. Now, if we're trying to change keys, we're basically trying to manipulate someone's brain into thinking that we have a new key center. And keep in mind that it's not a conscious process. They're not actively thinking about this. This is happening kind of in their subconscious mind. We're sort of manipulating it and getting it to feel a certain way about some certain note. So I want to show you how to do that. Let's take an example. Let's say we want to get from the key of C to the key of G. That's a pretty straightforward key change, and we'll go over why in a little bit. But let's say we're in C. C is that key center now. People's brains are attached to that note C. And we want to convince them that G is our new key center. Now, the strongest way to do this, the quickest and most powerful way to get them to sort of change their minds is to create tension and have that tension resolve to the G and not the C anymore. Once we start doing that, G starts to feel like that comfortable sort of, home note. And that's how we're going to get them to change their mind, sort of. So at this point, you're probably familiar with the 5-1 relationship, right? If you have a 1 chord, like if we're in the key of C, our 1 chord is that C major chord. And you have a 5 chord, again in the case of C, that would be a G chord. That 5 chord tends to develop some tension, and it wants to resolve into that 1 chord. And the main reason is because it has this leading tone in it. Like in C, it has this B natural, and that B natural wants to move into the C chord. Now what we want here in order to cause this key shift is we want a 5 chord of G. We're headed into G, so we want a tension chord that's going to resolve into G, into the key that we're headed towards. So in the case of G, the 5 chord of G is a D major chord. And this D major chord should give us some tension that we can resolve into the G. Now if you look at this chord, you should notice something interesting. It has this F sharp in it. And this F sharp does 3 things. First, it's the leading tone of G, right? It's just a half step lower than our G note. So that's great. That's that sort of tension we want. Also, if you think about the notes that are in the key of G, G has an F sharp in it. And that's that note right there. So we've just introduced one of the new notes that from the key that we're headed to. One of the other aspects of a key change is that we're going to have new notes that we want to introduce. And so we need the person listening to start getting comfortable with those new notes. So it's doing that. It's giving us this new note. And this chord, this D major chord, this is not one of the chords we normally get in the key of C. So it sounds a little bit odd. And that's a good thing, because since it sounds a little out of place, it helps us develop a little bit of that tension we're after. The person hearing that is kind of thinking, again, subconsciously, but they're thinking like, oh, that sounds a little strange. Where is this chord going? And once it moves into G, it's like, oh, it's going into G. And they're starting to become more attached to the key of G. So let's say we do this chord progression. We're trying to get from C to G. We're going to play a C major chord and then a D major chord. Remember, that one is significant because it's not normally part of our C chord, and we're using that to generate tension. And then we play a G chord. So let's see what happens. So let's say we're in C. Assume we've kind of played a few chords from the key of C. The brain is very attached to the C at this point, right? So we make our transitional progression here. So we play this D major chord, right? Develop some tension. Play a G chord. I'm playing this one inverted because I don't actually have room on this tiny keyboard. But we've resolved it to G. Now at this point, we actually don't quite have a key change. We're close, but not quite. So here's what's happening. Initially, the brain is kind of attached to this note C. We've developed some tension, we've resolved it to G, and we've kind of convinced it like, hey, there's this new note, and it's starting to feel kind of comfortable, like it could potentially be a key center. But the brain hasn't really forgotten about C yet either, right? So let's say I do that same thing, right? I'm in C, a few chords, C is my key center. Play the D, a little bit of tension, resolve it to G. And then if I go right back to C, my brain is thinking, oh yeah, C, right, that's the key center, great. And we never really quite made a transition. It's not going to listen to that C chord and sort of filter it against the G chord and think that G is the new key center. It's just gonna kind of flip right back to C as our key center. Now, even though we didn't get a key change here, that's still really cool. That is what's called a temporary tonicization, which is a ridiculous term. It just means that we've sort of set up G as this kind of temporary key center, played around with that for a second, and then just got back to our original key. And that's a cool kind of musical trick that gets used all the time. It's worth remembering just on its own. But we're interested in a key change. So how do we actually make that into a real key change? Well, all we really have to do, once we make that transition to G, we just have to sort of stay there. If we stay with G, we play a few chords and keep kind of coming back to G, maybe we do that D major chord again. At that point, we're really starting to establish G as a key center, and the human brain has pretty much forgotten about C. In fact, once we're there for a while, and we play another C chord, see if I can do this on this tiny piano. It doesn't hear C as a key center now. It's just hearing it like in relation to the G chord, and that's it. That's our key change. Now, let me give you another example here. Let's say we want to go from C to D. D has two notes different. D has an F sharp in it, just like the G did, but it also has a C sharp in it. So, same thing, we're in C, we've played a few chords, and the key center has been established, right? Here is our key center, right? We want to get to D. We want this to be our new key center. So, we're going to use the 5 chord of D. In this case, that would be an A major chord, right? So we're in C, we play an A major chord. Now I'm kind of just jumping around chords here. If you were really writing a piece of music, you'd probably make your voice leading a little better, invert chords and make them move more smoothly from one to another. But just for the sake of an example, right? We have this A major chord. It has this new note in it. It has a C sharp, right? So we've introduced one of the new notes in our key. That's a good thing, starting to get familiar. It's developed tension, and then we're going to resolve that into the D chord. Just like that. Remember, this is an inverted D chord. Hopefully you can see that. If I put this A up top, there's just my basic D chord, right? But I've resolved it into there, and now I'm at that kind of halfway point where I've set up D as a potential new key center. The brain is kind of halfway in between, thinking that C and D is the key center, and as long as we stay there, maybe we play that A major, D major transition again. As long as we do that, we're establishing D as a new key center. Now, this whole tension resolution idea, this is usually how you'd want to do a key change. It's the most convincing way to make it happen, but there are other ways. Remember, all we're really doing is convincing someone that they have a new key center. And we don't have to do it this way. There's something else that's called tonic by assertion, which is a pretty snooty name for what it is. All you're really doing when you're doing tonic by assertion is you're changing to a new chord, the key that you want, and you're just staying there. And you're not really worrying about setting up tension and resolving it. You're just sort of getting to this new key and just never leaving. It reminds me of this Mitch Hedberg joke. He says, if you're lost in the woods, build a house. I was lost, but now I live here. And that's all we're doing here. We're going to a new key and just staying there and never leaving. And eventually, the brain just kind of realizes like, okay, I guess I live here now. So here's an example of that. Let's say we're in C again, playing a few chords in C. Say I just move to, let's go to G again, right? Now, at this point, we're thinking, this is a 5 chord, it has tension, it wants to resolve to C. But if we just don't do that, and we stay there, maybe I play the G chord in a few different places. You go to an A minor chord, and then go back to G. Eventually, after a while, this will begin to feel like a key center. Now, at any point, we could do the D chord back to G. We actually do introduce some tension there, and that really establishes it. But even if we never ever did that, if we just stayed on G long enough, eventually the brain just kind of forgets about C and just starts thinking like, well, I guess G is my key center now. Now realize that those two ideas, those are like total polar opposites. You know, setting up tension and resolving it to your new key, that's like very convincing and very direct. Like, we're in a new key now. And so your brain, other than that, you know, little moment where it's a little confused, it never really gets lost. But if you're doing the tonic by assertion, there's going to be quite a while where it's not really clear what key you're in. You're hearing this chord, it sounds like it's tension at first, but it's just sort of slowly transitioning into something comfortable that no longer feels like tension. And that can take a long time. So that's not usually what people do when they write music, but it's certainly a valid way to do it. Just realize that the effect it has is very, very different. Now, there's one other thing to think about here, and one other possibility. I'm going to attempt to draw a circle of fifths. Best I can do. Now, if you haven't watched that video I did on the circle of fifths yet, you should, because it'll help you out a lot here. But one of the things we talked about, you know, one of the really powerful ways to use a circle of fifths was to use it to show you which keys are similar to each other and which ones aren't. And the reason why I did that example going from the key of C to the key of G is that there's only one new note in the key of G. And that's another aspect of what you're having to do when you're shifting keys. You're trying to make those new notes feel comfortable. If you have a whole bunch of new notes that you're trying to cram in there all at once, that's a really difficult transition. There's a lot to sort of take in all at once, and it winds up usually just being confusing instead of, you know, this nice clear shift from one key to another. So if we wanted to go from the key of C to the key of D flat, that is not nearly as easy to do as going from C to, say, D, right? There's only two notes different here, but in this case, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes different. That's much, much harder. So if we were kind of using this method that we have been, where you're kind of setting up some tension and then moving it in and trying to make everything feel smooth and connected and just sort of slowly convince someone's brain that they're transitioning, what we would probably do is go through a bunch of intermediate keys. You know, if we went to the left of the circle, we might go from C to F, or from C to B flat, and then maybe to E flat or A flat, and kind of slowly work our way around to D flat. Now, obviously, that's a lot of work and a lot of sort of transitions to make. Now, there is another way to do this, and you will hear this sometimes in certain styles of music. Rather than try to make everything smooth and connected and kind of hide the strangeness of these new notes, you can actually just kind of embrace it and just go with it. So let's say we're in C, right? We're playing some chords in the key of C, you know, establish that as our key center, and we want to go to D flat. We could just go to D flat, just slide everything up. It's so hard to play on these little tiny keys. And what we do there is we just kind of shove everything in all at once and say, oh, we're in a new key now. We just moved everything up. Now, that works. That is a way to get from C to D flat. And like I said, you will hear it sometimes. Usually, though, it's considered very cheesy. Most people don't like it. Personally, I think it sounds awful. But it is music, and you can do what you like, so you are the judge in what you want to use, you know, in your music. Now, I want to show you one final thing here. Let's say you want to go from a major key to a minor key, right? In fact, let's say we want to go from C major to A minor. Now, if you watch the other video I did on the circle of fifths, you'll know that you can also kind of add this inner ring of minor keys and see how the minor keys relate to all the major keys. But if we want to go from C to A minor, this is kind of interesting because we're actually transitioning to a key that doesn't have any new notes in it. You know, A minor shares all the same notes as C major. Now, fundamentally, what we're trying to do is the same thing. We're trying to shift our key center and generate some tension and have that resolve into A rather than C and convince the human brain that A is our new key center. But you have to be careful because in a minor key, you know, let's say just in the key of A minor, those are the notes we have normally, right? and we don't have a leading tone. G natural is what we usually get in the key of A minor, and G natural doesn't really generate any tension towards A. So if we're trying to get a quick, solid key change with tension resolution kind of thing, we kind of need that G sharp. So what you'll usually do, you say we're in C again. I know you're sick to death of this little progression. I hate it too, if that helps. But let's say we're trying to get to A. What we would probably do is we would use the 5 chord of A, which in this case is an E chord, but rather than just play an E minor, we'll make it an E major. And that gives us that leading tone. Now we're just kind of pulling this note out of nowhere, but we need it because we want it to generate tension and help us resolve into that A minor chord. So in this case, our progression is probably going to be C, E major, and then A minor. Now, if you didn't like that note, you just did not want to introduce a G sharp, what you could do is you could, say we're in C again, you move to an E minor chord, you don't bother introducing that G sharp, and you move to A. What you could do is something a little closer to tonic by assertion. You could just sort of stay here and stay in A and never really leave it. And after a while, same thing, the human mind will start to become attached to A rather than C, and you're essentially in the key of A minor. But just realize it's going to be a much slower process, and if you want that to happen quickly and solidly, you probably need that G sharp. So guys, I think that's it for key changes. This is a tough topic because there really is no right and wrong here. You're just kind of creating this effect by either generating tension and moving it over, or just kind of moving into a new key and staying there. But the important thing to remember is not so much the little details, but fundamentally what's really happening, that you're trying to convince someone that that you have this new key center, that they should start hearing this new note in this way. So there really is no formula for this, and once you start putting this in real music, it can get even more subtle in what exactly you do. So take the time to really get what's fundamentally happening here, and I think that helps you with everything else. Now the logical extension of this lesson is probably going to be modes. The idea of a mode, at least one aspect of a mode, is that you're taking a key center and you're surrounding it with notes that you don't normally do. Like you aren't just in the key of G major or G minor, you're doing something different, like D or G Dorian, where you're using other notes that aren't normally there in a major or minor key. So we will get to that soon. Stick around for that. But yeah, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next time.